The topic that we want to address is enormous, and I'm glad there's another panel that will thematically deal with it, because 30 minutes is definitely not going to be enough. But stating the problem is easier than finding a solution, as Amy had said. And the problem is very simple, is that gender inequality has not gone out of fashion and refuses to go out of fashion. And the task of this panel is to answer the question, can Africa leapfrog that problem? Can we effectively deal with gender inequality and move towards a more gender equal society? And what's really interesting about the work of the Africa Shared Value Leadership is an interesting hypothesis that is also part of our brief, which is to say, besides gender equality within the world of work, can we deal with gender-based violence in society at large? And to what extent can dealing with gender inequality within the world of work make a difference to reduce gender-based violence in society? And it's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting link between, for example, domestic violence and, let's say, the world of work and gender parity, income parity within the world of work. So that is the scene that I want to set. But I want to start off, and I thought, before Titilope and Lindi, we get into the systemic issues and the numbers and the policy questions, I wanted to ask you on a deeply personal level to share with us what your experience has been on the gender question. I mean, it is unfortunately still exceptional to have women in the boardroom, and you would have confronted a lot of hypermasculinity in the course of your work life. Do you still deal with that? And what are those battle scars that you carry with you?
Wow. Yeah, it's quite a question. I started work at a very, very progressive company called Liberty Group, and I spent probably the first 18 years of my career there. And despite being a very equity and equality focused organization, an organization is still the sum total of the people who work in it. And an organization is a microcosm of the society in which that company exists. And so it's been quite a steep climb, overcoming prejudices around my age, around my gender, around my complexion, etc. Should I be at the table? And if I am at the table, should I be speaking at the table? And if I am speaking at the table, should I be listened to? And if I am listened to, should anybody take stock and attribute anything to me beyond, here's a lollipop, thanks for participating. But having said that, there are also a great many amazing men that I have come across. And that's why I absolutely loved it when you said, we men must start to become part of the conversation and part of the solution, because I can say hand on heart, it is when men owned the conversation around my career, my opportunities, my abilities, that these were seen for what they are. We very often have to shout louder, do more, etc. as women to earn ourselves a seat at the table, a lot more than men do. And whether we like it or not, this is the journey that we've been on. So I am glad that we now have allies, because I found that that unlocked a world of opportunity for me.
Thank you. I think you provided a very great context. Having worked for about 2 decades, I find it quite interesting that, that needle has not moved an inch. However, it's been a progressive journey in the last 5 to 10 years. Personally, I think that the conversations are beginning to hold a lot more. And we are beginning to live in the consciousness of bridging that gender gap. I work in the manufacturing sector, and it's about 1 out of 10 employees would be female, and that really is alarming. Are the girls going to school, especially in my home country? Maybe, but when it comes to getting to that point of their career where they own a seat at the table, they're having the right conversations, that is where the real work begins. And there are quite a number of indices that speak to how we can better manage that gap. Organizations like mine, Lafarge Africa, is committed to gender diversity and inclusion. We have models, we have frameworks in place that support, all of the ambitions that we have around gender diversity, and we are implementing same. I also like to point out that given my work as head of sustainable development, there's a huge gap still in the communities. So limited access to education for the girls, exposure in terms of the things they have access to, and even younger women and the older women. And that is where the real work is, in the informal sector. How do we bridge that gap, even between not just the men and the women, but between the private and the informal sector, which is actually the largest sector of the economy? That is where the real work is.
I, think that if you value something, you'll be more likely to put in an effort. And not in any profound kind of way. I often like to ask someone like, "Oh, do you go to the gym?" And they'll say, "Oh, no, I don't have time." And I always chuckle at that response, because of course we only have 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
But how we divvy up our time and what we do with it tells us something about what is important to us, what matters to us, right? And I often wonder whether men in particular value human rights and value gender equality. Because if we did, then we would be doing some of the things that you are talking about and that Amy was talking about. But it seems to me that one of the biggest problems we have is that us as men want to hold on to our power, and we have to be that honest about it. I am tired of hearing keynote speeches from progressive men and from women that tells me about the latest McKinsey research, Stanford research, that it makes business sense to take equality seriously, that diversity is conducive to maximizing the value proposition of a company. We know that, you know what I mean, Lindi? Like, how many more studies does it take to prove that even if you don't care about the moral case for gender equality, that the business case should excite you as a capitalist?
Yeah.
But it still doesn't move us as men. I feel like a broken record. I've had this conversation even before I went grey, because the data changed marginally, but the fundamental insight, it makes business sense to care about gender equality. That insight has now been established forever.
Yeah.
Given that truth, don't you despair that we are taking so long when the case has been made forever and a day?
Yeah. You would think, the prospect of adding $12 trillion to global GDP in the next 10 years would excite people. We often hear that men don't make emotional decisions. They make decisions based on the data, based on the facts and so forth. And somehow these facts are not turning the dial. And it says to me, at an intrinsic human level, where power is concerned and power dynamics and relationships are concerned, people will hold on to privilege even when it doesn't make sense to. We see it in all forms of classism, racism, gender sort of inequality is propped up by the need of people who are fundamentally insecure to open up the space to others, even though all the evidence favors a situation where you have those others at the table. Some can say the same of cisgendered people, that they are comfortable within their space, and when you have to open up the dialogue and say, acknowledge and recognize other genders out there and the rights that they have, people react a particular way. So to me, it astounds me that the business case, so well articulated repeatedly, and you're right, with marginal shifts in how it's articulated from time to time. I mean, right now, we're in a global economy that is seeking to grow again after all the impacts of lockdowns and so forth. And again, it's women bearing the brunt.
Yep.
Women are the ones who are almost twice more likely to lose out on opportunities following all of these things. It is women who have suffered more from gender-based violence, stuck under lockdown conditions with their abusers. And as we claw our way back, we now have to claw back from a regressive stance because
Absolutely.
we have moved back.
Titilope, the same question to you. Do you despair in the face of resistance? Because, as we've said, men pretend to be unemotive and these rational calculators, but the truth is we are very territorial. We don't want you in the boardroom. We're prepared to take a hit in the bottom line to keep you out.
I think that, over the last century, there are so many things that are ingrained in the society, like cultural norms, that speak a lot to, the disposition of men to, gender equality, gender rights, human rights as a whole. And I think that until we begin to call that out consciously over and over, it will not make that kind of impact that we desire. So we see the statistics, we even understand the potentials, growth in the industry, growth in the economy. But, when it comes to taking that action, then we see the men, not coming out as fully and as importantly as they should. And that, calls for some concern. Now, what are the things that we can do? Because, again, it's important that we're not getting pessimistic about, what the opportunities are. What are the things that we can do? First, I think it is important that, at a national level, and I'm glad that we are speaking about at this conference about One Africa, One Voice. At a continental level, we need policy initiatives, strong policy initiatives that support gender equality and inclusion. And I'd always say we have national economic blueprints, we have national economic agendas. Why can't we have a national gender diversity blueprint? Why can't we have a regional gender diversity blueprint? Those things are important. And when we have those things, we begin to cascade and drill down to, economies, to nations, even to organizations. What of our policy frameworks? How strong are they? I like the Sustainable Development Goals, and I like the way that, organizations, especially in the private sector, call out the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 5, gender equality. But we cannot afford to be superficial about it, especially when it comes to gender equality. So there are targets, there are indicators. How many organizations are measuring their performance with these targets and these indicators? With gender equality, I believe we need to go a lot more granular so that we can achieve the targets that we intend to achieve.
I think that's a perfect way to move into the practicalities. I totally agree, Titilope, and I think you've set us up. And there are two levels to it that I want us to drill down into. There is policy, legislative framework, because you need both carrots and sticks. If the carrot won't work, if appeal to ethics don't work, then you've got to incentivize, or if necessary, make it obligatory. Right? And then the second set of practical questions are, if we look at one company, not necessarily the economy and the legislative framework, what can happen in that particular company? Let's start with the latter first, Lindi. And I'll just kickstart the conversation, and then take over as someone who's got the business experience that I lack. But it seems to me that what Titilope is saying is absolutely spot on. If you don't measure it, then you can't know how you're getting on. If you don't have the goal, then you can't even know what you are measuring. And the kind of things that should be done are very simple things that are powerful. Link the CEO's bonus and performance with the contractual KPIs to gender equality. Define gender equality in your workplace. Go literally to payroll and have a look. What is the income inequality between women and men in your company? And other measurements, such as look at the data, the cohort that got into the company in year one in 2015, divvy them up, men and women, who has been promoted and who hasn't, over 6 years period of time, and who's responsible to make sure that the career mapping provides equal opportunities for men and women. And that's the granularity and specificity that we need, and we need to link it to whether or not you get kicked out from a middle management and a top management position.
I would agree with that. And with that being said, I think we mustn't lose sight, as Titilope said, we mustn't be pessimistic around this. We have seen a South Africa and a Rwanda that has added 25% and 17% of women to their middle management, and that starts to form a good pipeline for succession to senior roles. But with that being said, we do see that there is a leaky bucket. There's women who drop off for various reasons. It is important that our partners in the corporate sector examine and understand the reasons for that. It's all too easy to put it down to women opt out because they want to have babies, women opt out because they don't want the big jobs, women opt out. There are all sorts of narratives that are all over the place, but those are not actually the true reasons. Do corporates do enough to ensure that the culture of the environment is conducive to women succeeding? Do we understand enough about the second shift when women get home, the fact that they do a lot more unpaid care work in the home than men do? And even now during the pandemic, that secondary care work when they got home because children were being educated from home fell disproportionately on women. So there is a load balancing that kind of doesn't happen. And I do believe it is correct for us to not only formulate the policies, because in the South African context, the policies are there. It is, however, left to organizations to get themselves in accordance with their employment equity planning, etc., to whatever state they believe best represents equality and equity in their space. But we saw from the recent Women's Economic Assembly that there are dynamics, there are industries, you belong to an industry that's very, very heavily male. There are industries that have sustained a trajectory of not being inclusive to women. That has to change. And part of that is information asymmetry. Women are left out of the information that they need to participate meaningfully there, whether it is through procurement, whether it is through trade, whether it is through training for those kinds of environments. And yet we have demonstrated, and even if you look at results of school, tertiary, etc., women have demonstrated their capability and ability. I do think we need to get away from the point where we are talking everybody into our attributes and we are selling our own value proposition. It is a self-evident as well as tested statistically by all the studies that you have mentioned. We need to implement them. It is necessary for our growth.
I totally agree with everything Lindi says and with what you said before, that we can't be pessimistic, we must be granular, let's be pragmatic. But I want to push both of you a little bit. I think you're being too nice on my gender. We are very crafty in the ways in which we keep you out. Can we talk in terms of that specificity that you invited us to talk about things that are not visible to the naked eye, culture that is male-centric, that appears to be part of a meritocracy in my company, but actually it is not a meritocracy. These are values that are infused within my corporate culture that tend to favor characteristics that are disproportionately found in a body with a penis. And I'll give you an example. As a communications coach, I have on many occasions been invited by law firms to come and work with a Lindi, and the basic brief will be, oh, Lindy's very smart, she's got an LLB, she's fantastic, we're thinking of making her partner, but she just has a communication problem. I say, shut. I'll work with Lindy one-on-one. Let's do it. Step one, I have to assess her current skill set so I know what we are working with. I will listen to Lindi, or I'll come and sit in the room at the back here at a conference at the Maslow secretly, and Lindi doesn't know, and I'm taking notes as the coach, doing the diagnostic first. And there's nothing wrong with Lindi. Are any of you finding her boring? Are any of you thinking that she is not eloquent? She can't communicate? But what they really mean is, in our company, you have to be loud and boisterous like Eusebius. That is the ultimate yardstick of what it means to be a confident man. And all that really is a performance of rage. It is a performance of testosterone. So if you really want gender equality, we're going to have to talk about everything even if it's pessimistic, from the pay inequality to HR telling you that Titilope must go on a Toastmasters course to help her how to speak.
So I like the perspective that you provided, and I think that with gender equality, it involves a multi-stakeholder approach, and it is not just the male gender, it is not just the leadership of organizations, it is a lot more all-encompassing. And I'd like to take it from the smallest unit of the nation, which is the family. How are we orientating our children, the male child, the female child? I have only daughters, and based on my experience and exposure, I know the things that I tell them. But how many parents, can tell their children the things that I tell my daughters? I also know that even as exposed as I am, I have quite a number of contemporaries who are even bothered that they do not have male children. And they think as women, it is my responsibility to give a male child. And so, all of those things are those, deeper things that we cannot see, that, informs our decisions, the kind of narratives that we are projecting as societies. That said, I think that, in organizations, the people element of performance management systems is critical. And when I say the people element, it's not just how an organization performs in terms of bottom line. How much millions or trillions of dollars were we able to, get, at the end of the year? What was our EBIT and all of that? I think it is a lot more about how we are, connecting the dots between our people, our performance, and how that impacts the society at large. And the simplest of it all is, the GDP. What contributions, the people can make to the GDP. Now, speaking to the women, there was an International Labour Organization survey that happened in 2019, and about 13,000 enterprises were consulted. And the survey shows or revealed that, companies that were led by women, achieved an average of 15% increase in profits. And, that tells a lot. So connecting those dots, the woman in the organization, the corporate performance, and the contributions to the society, we need to see those linkages, and we need to call them out a lot more.
Absolutely.
And I always say that, for women, we also need to, own the whole. We won't get far if we are timid, if we are not confident. It would involve a lot of work because, of course, the society places a lot of pressure on us. The society, expectations here and there, the domestic affairs are there, and you have to go the extra mile to thrive, in the workplace. But that said, I think that for the women, it's an investment worth making, because the better or the more opportunities we have to be at the C-suite, the more women we can, and hold to get to that level, the more of our stories that we can tell. I said it to someone yesterday. What happened to folklore, for example? In Nigeria, we had a lot of stories around, heroines who did great, amazing things. But those things vanished into thin air. So what happened to all of those stories? We need to tell our stories a lot more as women. We need to support each other a lot more. And we need to, have those conversations like this one, where all stakeholders understand their roles and their responsibilities.
I'm very sad that we only have 7 minutes left, but I want to headline 2 themes before we close. The first, and I love how your answers segue to exactly where I wanted to go. Women supporting each other. So there's men, there's us as blockages, how we need to be allies. There's also the interesting question around what kind of support you give each other, right? So it's we've got to pull all the levers to get to gender equality. And I sometimes find with minority groups or oppressed groups, We don't scaffold each other in the
Yeah.
same way in which straight white men do. They look out for each other. They vouch for each other. How important is it, Lindi, that we also study the white straight male and then reverse engineer their success and do it ourselves? They hang out together, they mentor each other. When there is the leadership that is talking about promotions, they will say, I've worked with Lindi on my team, she's ready to be senior associate. We don't set up those kinds of social networks and then leverage it within corporate.
I think that's a very important point. Look, I have two views around that. It is true that there is such a thing called a queen bee syndrome because, of course, as many men are insecure, you also find women who are insecure, and that happens with insecure women. But the overwhelming majority of female leaders that I have come across are people. I remember my last 3 CEO appointments. It was women who celebrated me, women who came to the table. They are all CEOs, CFOs, members of boards of directors, and so forth. The role that I'm in now at the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Fund, it is a woman who said to another woman, there is a woman who has built a career in financial services who can add value here because this is the space and time she needs to be in. That was a woman. So women do need to create space and hold space for one another. I think we do have to perfectly embody the strength that we are and open and stand at the door. Don't just open the door and look away and carry on
Absolutely.
walking. Open, stand at the door and make sure that your sisters are coming in to the door. It is the only way that we are going to create critical mass at those spaces where it makes a difference. When you hear that 1 in 3 women are victims of abuse, every 8 hours, a woman dies in this country at the hands of an intimate male partner. There's a whole lot more going on with the woman than what you see. So the importance of reaching out, holding the hand, and looking back and making sure that people are coming, people are able to. If there are obstacles and you happen to be ahead, going back and eliminating those obstacles because you have the platform. We have to create platforms for each other to ascend and succeed.
Titilope, the last theme is completely different, but I want to just signal it, and I'll give you 2 minutes to comment on it. It connects with what you were saying, that we need to talk about regional cooperation and what we can do. How important is it for us to also, in another occasion, talk about strategically setting up a political movement, even though none of us as voters are single-issue voters? We're too complex to be single-issue voters. When it comes to elections, for example, and our relationship with our governments and how we hold them accountable, gender equality wasn't even part of our conversation in South African elections recently. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of the politics of gender equality.
Well, I think that with gender equality and politics, again, it involves everyone. And, the woman is really the basis and the foundation of every society. Now, that said, representation at all levels is one thing that must be at the heart of, every administration or government in power. How do these things happen? I think there are systematic approaches to achieving that. But again, it goes beyond elections or nominations to electoral positions. I think it's been more deliberate about representation at all levels. And how can we achieve this? It's to, technocrats find comfort in their spaces to say, oh, I'm a business professional, my business is not politics. But we need to begin to see the business of politics and the politics in business and, marry those two together to ensure that, whether at the regional level or at national levels, representation for women is obvious, is evident, and is backed up by credible actions. I tell people that nobody can pursue or push the women agenda more than the woman. So if the women are in the right places, I am sure that we would move this needle, from an inch to a mile. And when we do that progressively, we would be able to achieve that scalable impact that we desire over the next decade and over the next century.
I want to end this discussion by underscoring what our keynote speaker, Amy, had said, and addressing the men in the room and the men who are watching online, particularly the one with the most social and economic power, CFOs and CEOs, because you have the most opportunity to make a difference immediately as soon as this conference ends. You have the luxury of picking from two different kinds of reason for why you should care about gender equality. Two kinds of reason. If the one doesn't work for you, you can pick the other one, or both. The one reason is that it is the right thing to do as a matter of commitment to morality and human rights. That reason should be enough to persuade you to pick up the phone and ask payroll what your pay parity is in your company or lack thereof. The second reason is maybe you don't give a damn about morality, but you care about maximizing profit. That's a good reason. Maybe you hate women, but you love money. If you love money, love women as a means to an end.